Ancient Greece. Usually, many things about the world around us go unnoticed. Most of the time, we don't ask many questions about everyday things. For example, who designed our buildings? When was our system of government invented? Where do our stories and myths come from? Interestingly, a lot of Western culture comes from the ancient Greeks, 800 to 500 BC, who lived about 2,500 years ago. Greece is a country in southeastern Europe. At that time, it was a center of science, art, and culture. Have you ever been to the theater? Do you think about science and nature? Do you live in a democratic society? In each of these areas, the ancient Greeks developed important ideas that we still use today. City-states. Ancient Greece wasn't actually a country 2,500 years ago. Rather, it was a group of city-states. Each city-state had its own government and army. Two of the most famous were called Athens and Sparta. This was a glorious era in Greek history. The ancient Greeks were interested in everything. They built the best army in the world. They were pioneers in science, and they thought about how people could live better lives. They made some of the most beautiful art, and they wrote some of the greatest stories, especially about their gods and heroes. Let's look at some of these amazing developments. The Greek Army. The Greeks were very warlike and thought that all men should be able to fight. They fought with spears, swords, and shields. They wore armor and helmets. Can you imagine what war in ancient Greece was like? You would be able to see your enemies' eyes and hear their cries as you fought them hand to hand. The Greeks developed some great military tactics. One tactic was called the phalanx. In the phalanx, the soldiers lined up together. They held long spears, with the front lines all pointing their spears to the front. Their enemies could not come close without being hurt. The phalanx made the Greek army the most powerful in the world. They were able to defeat many of their enemies. A slave society. When the Greeks defeated their enemies, they made some of them into slaves. Ancient Greece was what we call a slave society. Their slaves were forced to work for the Greeks without pay. They had to do whatever the Greeks told them to do. The lives of slaves were full of hard work. They grew the plants, cooked the meals, and cleaned the houses. Owning slaves meant that the Greeks had a lot of spare time. This was one of the reasons they had time for other pursuits. They were able to organize a new type of government, think about how the world works, and make beautiful art. Who invented democracy? The Greeks thought a lot about the best kind of government. Was it best to live in a monarchy where a king reigns and the people obey? The ancient Greeks who lived in Athens did not think so. Instead, they invented what we call democracy. Democracy means people power, and a democracy is when everyone can vote for their leaders. In Athens, only adult male citizens were allowed to vote. They met on a hill called the Pnyx 2 or 3 times a month. During the meetings, the men would discuss many important issues and vote by a show of hands. Often, speakers debated and tried to convince the men in the crowd to vote in a particular way. Philosophers and scientists. When they weren't thinking about their government, many Greeks liked to think about the meaning of life. Why are we here? How do we live a happy life? How do we know if we are good people? A philosopher is a person who asks these profound or deep questions. The word philosophy means the love of wisdom. There were many famous Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. Many people still read their books. Often, the Greek philosophers were also scientists. They developed a lot of the mathematics that we learn at school. They also invented the alarm clock, the odometer, which is used to measure the distance a bicycle or car travels, and the science of map making. They discovered many things and were very innovative. Socrates was one of the most intelligent philosophers. He was also a bit peculiar. He wore the same clothes all year round. Plus, he liked walking around the city and asking people questions about their lives. He would talk to anyone, young or old, slave or free, man or woman. Socrates asked them questions about everything. In the year 399 BC, 3 Greeks accused Socrates of not worshipping the city's gods and of being a bad influence on young Greeks. At his trial, Socrates refused to give up philosophy. The jury sentenced him to death, and he was forced to drink poison. Greek stories. The Greeks were great at telling stories. In particular, they wrote famous poems and plays about their gods and heroes. Maybe you have seen or read a Greek tragedy in school. Famous Greek plays still performed today include Medea by Euripides, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, and Lysistrata by Aristophanes. The Greeks seemed to prefer plays that were tragedies over comedies. Greek tragedies were often about heroes who made terrible mistakes. The plays were performed in beautiful outdoor theaters called amphitheaters. Many of these theaters still exist. Another great writer from ancient Greece was Homer. He wrote long poems about Greek heroes, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They are still famous today. Greek gods and heroes. The Greeks believed in many gods. There was the god of love, the god of hunting and war, the god of fire, and the god of the sea. These gods were always meddling in the lives of the Greeks and causing trouble. The Greeks also had many legendary heroes and incredible monsters. These monsters included the Cyclops, which was a giant with only one eye. They also included the terrifying Hydra, which was a 9-headed water snake. These myths are so interesting and imaginative that we still remember them today. Movies like Hercules and Troy feature brave heroes and terrifying monsters from ancient Greece. The Minotaur and Medusa. Maybe you have heard of some famous Greek legends. One legend was the story of the Minotaur, a creature who was half man and half bull. One day, the queen of Crete gave birth to the Minotaur. The king was so horrified that he hid the Minotaur in a maze. Every year the king fed young men and women to the Minotaur. One day, a brave hero called Theseus entered the maze. He tied the end of a ball of string to his starting place and kept the ball with him. As he searched the maze, he left a trail of string behind him. This was how he found his way out after he fought and killed the Minotaur. Another exciting legend is the story of Medusa. Medusa was one of 3 horrible sisters. They all had snakes instead of hair. If you looked into Medusa's eyes, she would turn you to stone. She was one of the scariest monsters. The brave hero Perseus went to kill Medusa. To avoid looking at Medusa's eyes, he carried a shield. This shield was polished so that it looked like a mirror. Perseus looked into the shield instead of at Medusa herself. Finally, he saw Medusa and her sisters sleeping. Perseus crept up on Medusa quietly and cut off her head. Then he escaped from Medusa's sisters using a hat that made him invisible. Greek art. Many of these myths are depicted in Greek art. The Greeks liked to paint their gods and heroes on pots. They also made sculptures of them. What makes some art beautiful and some art ugly? Many people think that Greek sculpture and pottery are some of the most beautiful ever made. Have a look at the sculptures and the pottery on this page. Are they beautiful? What do you think? Greek art has influenced many artists throughout history. Lots of famous artists have painted scenes from Greek stories. Beautiful buildings. The Greeks built many beautiful buildings. They invented their own style. They liked to include columns and intricate details. The most famous Greek building is called the Parthenon. The remains of the Parthenon still stand on a hill in the center of the Greek city of Athens. Some people say that it was once the most magnificent building in the world. It is still quite beautiful. Important buildings around the world often copy the Greek style. Many libraries, government buildings, and even homes use columns, for example. Are there any buildings built in a classical Greek style in your hometown? A part of our heritage. Ancient Greece is part of our heritage. We still tell ancient Greek stories and perform ancient Greek plays. We still study the science and philosophy that they left behind. We still copy their sculptures and buildings. Greek democracy lasted only 200 years, but the idea returned thousands of years later. Most of us live in democratic countries today. Perhaps now you will become more aware of the ancient Greek influences in your everyday life. But what about our own time? What things do you think we might leave for the future? Which of our buildings will last? What cultural influences will be our legacy?